I just want to say how grateful on behalf of the George Family Foundation we are that you're here. I'm Penny George, and I'm chair of the foundation, and I hope that you go away with whatever it is that you might have most wanted. I want to say thank you to our speakers and to the people who have done the breakout session, to all of the healers, those and all the rest of you. And thank you too to our wonderful team that put this on, Suzanne and Marnita and Liz and Ellen and the rest of the George Family Foundation. So thank you all. And now I have the pleasure of introducing our final speaker. More than anyone perhaps in the country, Henry Emmons is helping shift the consciousness of psychiatry in the direction of optimizing mental well-being across the continuum of health and illness. He's a local and a national treasure, and we are very fortunate to have him here this afternoon. Henry is a psychiatrist of immense intelligence, integrity, and humility. He practices locally with Partners in Resilience, which is a firm that he founded, and he and his team have integrated into their care model the healing forces of movement, nutrition, natural supplements and therapies, and also the psychology of mindfulness. He's the author of a number of best-selling books, including The Chemistry of Joy, which is about healing from depression, The Chemistry of Calm, which helps people understand and master anxiety, and Staying Sharp, which teaches us how to keep our brains and minds youthful as we age. Dr. Emmons will share with us how trauma harms not only the people most directly affected by it, but also those who care for them. Stress-related disorders are more prevalent than ever among healthcare providers, as you well know. Maintaining a healthy mind and an open heart is more important than ever. Blending the latest in Western ways of knowing in neuroscience and teachings from ancient wisdom traditions, Dr. Emmons will teach us how we can maintain serenity and restore calmness and joy, even in the face of unremitting stress. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Penny, for that beautiful introduction. And thanks to all of you for staying this late in the day. It has been just a beautiful day. And I just want to take a moment to thank the George family and all of the people from the foundation who helped to put this together, and Suzanne and the Catalyst Fund. This has really been an amazing day, and I think we all agree on that. I just feel so honored and humbled, really, to be up on here following those two amazing women who spoke earlier today. It's just an honor to be here. So thank you so much. So I am going to attempt to pull together some of the things that we have been hearing and working with and thinking about during this day. I want to do it in the context of my work, which is as a psychiatrist and working with people who have struggled with their resilience. And I want to talk a little bit about how I think about that work and trying to create a model, really. And particularly from the vantage point of those of us who are working in this field, how do we take care of ourselves? How do we nurture our own hearts, and how do we sustain ourselves so that we can keep being of service to others throughout a lifetime? So I don't know how many of you remember this movie, but there was a movie some years ago with Billy Crystal, and it was called City Slickers. So I have spoken to some audiences who have no idea what I'm talking about when I mention this. But if you remember this movie, Billy Crystal portrayed a kind of neurotic, early middle-aged guy who was struggling and stressed out, and his friends convinced him to go to this dude ranch to sort of find himself again. So he did, and in this dude ranch there was this cowboy played by Jack Palance, a guy named Curly in the show, and he kept portraying himself as knowing the answer to life. He kept saying, there is one thing you could do. And the implication was, if you only knew what it was, you'd be happy too. And I'm not going to tell you what it is. And finally, by the end of the show, they get alone, the two of them, and Billy Crystal kind of badgers him into finally revealing the secret to life, the one thing. And just before he's about to reveal it, Curly has a heart attack and dies. So I'm telling you that if I'm still standing at the end of this talk, I am going to reveal that one thing that you can do. I'm not kidding either. So there's a beautiful quote by Margaret Mitchell, who wrote Gone with the Wind. She said, every problem has two handles. You can grab it by the handle of fear or the handle of hope. I think today, as much as anything, we have been invited to find some handles of hope, and I want to do that as well. So what I think of, when I think of these labels that we use for mental illness, we talk about depression, anxiety, and other names that we give these things. What I really think is going on, at least in most cases, is that the person's natural, inborn resilience has somehow been eroded. It has somehow been affected so that they're not able to self-heal the way that they were designed to do. And there's a lot of evidence that this is really becoming a major public health problem. So just in my field, just in terms of treating depression, there's evidence over this last 100 years that every decade, every time the US Census, there's been another survey looking at people's mental health and well-being and finding that it's worsened by about 10% every 10 years, so that the rates of depression and anxiety keep going up in a somewhat exponential fashion. Martin Seligman, who some of you know, he's known for positive psychology, he says it this way. He says, if you're born after World War II, your chances of becoming depressed are about 10 times higher than if you'd simply been born at the turn of the last century. Depression is already the #1 cause of disability in our country, and the rest of the world, including developing nations, are rapidly catching us. The World Health Organization says by the year 2025, depression will be the #1 cause of disability around the world. It is no surprise, if you work in the healthcare field, that healthcare professionals suffer from this very same phenomenon. It's called burnout. If you're a health professional, it's not labeled as depression necessarily, but they look very much the same. This survey recently, just done last year by Mayo Clinic, of physicians around the country found that 54% of physicians are showing one or more of these signs of burnout. Lack of interest, fatigue, unprofessional behaviors, lack of empathy, anger, impatience, irritation. 54%. There's another survey showing that at least 40% of physicians wish that they could retire no matter what their age is now. So no matter, at every cohort, they're thinking, how do I get out of this? Now, this is not a sustainable thing for those of us in healthcare. So what's going on? I think of this in very simple terms, that there are one or more of these three factors that are impacting people's natural resilience. There is an element of imbalance or toxicity, without question. Changes in our diet, changes in how much we move our bodies or how much we sleep. These kind of things create imbalances in the body that we do have to address if we want to overcome these things and come back to health. I'll say a little bit more about that later. Second area, kind of large area, is what I call an unsettled mind. And simply put, this is the effect of stress, or being overly busy, or experiencing vicarious trauma, where we are not maybe traumatized ourselves, but we're constantly hearing stories that are a little bit traumatizing over and over and over again, so that the mind becomes unsettled, it becomes restless, it becomes agitated, and it becomes unhappy, a source of unhappiness. And then thirdly, a term we heard this morning, the illusion of separation, this belief that is very widely sown into our belief system that we're somehow separate from others, that we're in this very tough thing called our lives and we're in it alone. That's a really hard thing to overcome if that's really one's belief system. So how are we dealing with this? How do we do as a healthcare system in addressing these kinds of things? This is one window into this and how effective or ineffective it is. This is a survey being done here in Minnesota looking at treatment of depression in a primary care clinic, and there's 115 clinics across the state participating. There's a questionnaire. If any of you go to a primary care clinic for almost any reason, they are very likely to ask you to fill out this questionnaire called the PHQ-9, looking at whether you show signs of depression. And what they do then is they track those. If somebody has signs of depression, they'll be treated for it, and then they track to see how well that treatment works. Well, what is the treatment by and large? It's medication. Almost always, the first-line treatment in that kind of a setting is a medication. And this is showing us how effective or ineffective that is. So of all these 115 clinics, there's only 10 of them that get a rate of remission at 6 months of around 25% to 30%, roughly a quarter of people recovering from this through the usual way that we're treating it. That's actually the exception. The average is much lower than that, somewhere around 8 to 10%, which is not a good ratio of recovery or healing. So I want to share with you my definition of resilience and how I think we can approach this differently. So I'm talking now about individual resilience, and I use this metaphor of a water cooler or a container that I imagine each of us carries with us. We have this somewhere in our brain or our body, this elixir that keeps us able to face whatever stresses, whatever challenges we have in our lives, and even if we are knocked down, even if we are traumatized, it allows us to get ourselves back up, to right ourselves again. It allows us, in other words, to heal. Now, there are some important variables here. Not everyone has the same capacity for this kind of natural resilience. There are genetics involved here. There are also early childhood experiences that I think do affect one's capacity to be able to withstand life's challenges. But I believe that no matter what your capacity is, no matter how big or small this container, as long as you are doing the things that keep it partially filled up, enough, just enough of this stuff, then you will not develop these signs that we call burnout or depression. If you can find out what are the things that drain you of this, and what do you need to fill yourself back up? How can you restore yourself? I'm going to share very briefly the work that I have been doing and working with others to create programs for resilience. And actually this program called Resilience Training was started at the Penny George Institute for Health and Healing, which many of you know is at Abbott Hospital and now spread out throughout the cities through Alina. So we started a program there including these three interventions. We use integrative nutrition, we use movement or fitness, and then we also use mindfulness practices. And I'm going to say more about how we use these things in a bit. So we did these groups. We did healing circles. We still do that. We bring about 15 to 20 people together. It's a very cost-effective way to provide care, by the way. And we train them in skills. So we are not doing psychotherapy per se. We're not attempting to do group therapy. We're attempting to give people really good, healthy, emotional skills, learning how to work with their thoughts and their emotions in ways that can restore this natural capacity for resilience and prevent the problems that keep draining it in the future. So we developed this program and then we studied it. And I just want to very quickly compare our results with the results you just saw a moment ago. So we did two groups. One group went through the program right away, and the second group had to wait a few months before they went through it. And so while they waited, they served as a control group. And then when they went through, their data was included as an intervention. So I'm only going to show you one slide. We looked at several different variables, but the one I'm going to show you is that same test that we looked at earlier, the PHQ-9, which is looking at rates of depression. And what you see here is that the two treatment groups, the kind of reddish and greenish groups, improved really significantly through no medications, no individual psychotherapy, just through doing a group that looked at or that helped people develop some of these skills. And what you see here at the end, people's rate of recovery is really significant. Over 50% of people recovered completely as compared to 8 to 23%. And almost everybody recovered at least partially, even if they didn't get quite to the level of complete remission. So why does this kind of thing work? I want to couch this in terms of some of the new learnings that we have from neuroscience, because I feel like that's a really validating way and also a really important way for us to understand how do we help people recover from all these traumas and experiences that are depleting them. So the first thing I want to talk about kind of briefly is genetic expression. It also goes by the name epigenetics. What it means essentially, it's telling us that our DNA, we think about our DNA and we get half of it from one parent, half from the other, and we think about that's what determines our health or our well-being, and that's what decides whether we get this illness or that. It's partly true, but it's only partly true. There's another area of genetic material that surrounds the DNA. It used to be called junk DNA because nobody really knew what it did or what it was for. They just assumed it was extra stuff. Well, it turns out in this junk DNA, there are all sorts of channels. They're kind of like a series of gateways or passages, and that is really what determines whether the code within our DNA gets expressed in our cells or not. And if those codes get expressed, let's say we do have some illness genes, if they become expressed, it is also possible to turn them off again. So it's like we need to find the switch. What's the switch that we need to use to turn off an illness gene once it has been manifested? Here are some of the things that we know about. Some of the things that turn on illness genes are public health issues that we've long known are issues. Alcohol and tobacco use, endocrine disruptors, which include things in our environment, pollutants, toxins, plastics, and importantly, the effects of intense or long-term stress. I think it is one of the primary drivers of activating these illness genes. But there are other things, let's grab this by the handle of hope. There are other things that help to turn these genes off again. And this is what I really try to emphasize with my patients. Let's say you have struggled with an anxiety or stress-related problem for most of your life. Is it still possible to find the key that turns off the gene? And I believe it is, and I've seen it happen over and over again. So some of the things that might do that are the bright colors in fruits and vegetables, exercise or movement, and the cultivation of positive emotions. It's not only the negative emotions or stress that affect us, but what are we doing to cultivate some of the things we've been talking about today, creating a sense of love or compassion or connection. So I'm going to go through what I consider to be the 7 roots of resilience. The first is to find a way to balance the brain or the body without necessarily relying upon medications. I do use medications. I think there's a role for them. I'm not bashing them. But as we heard so beautifully at lunch today, our bodies are designed to heal themselves if we find the information that they need in order to do so. And I think that information, for the brain at least, comes primarily through our diet, through our nutrition. The brain has a big job to do. It has to, among other things, it has to create these different chemicals that affect mood, and it has to do so through the materials it gets in our food and in our diet. So I'm not going to go into detail about this because this is really a long subject. I'm just going to summarize it the way Michael Pollan did in 7 words. Eat food, not too much, mostly vegetables or mostly plants. Eat real food, food that your grandparents or great-grandparents would have recognized as food. The kind of food, in other words, that we have evolved to eat, to process, to get a wide variety of things, eating differently at different times of the year. Not too much. Almost all the research looking at this says it is really the excess numbers of calories, particularly in the form of sugar, that is so hard on brain function. Literally causes your brain to shrink, the brain tissues to shrink, if your blood sugar remains elevated too much of the time. And then mostly plants. Doesn't have to be all plants, but mostly a plant-based diet. Second area of this neuroscience is called neurogenesis. And simply put, this means that the brain, like every other part of our body, is capable of regenerating, restoring cells that have been lost through trauma, through brain injuries, through strokes. Our body and even the brain is able to heal to a large degree. It can't replace all those cells, but it can certainly replace some of them. And this happens throughout our lifetimes. There are stem cells, as you may know, that reside right in the memory center, the hippocampus, that part of the brain that is so crucial to how we remember things and how we age, how our brain functions as we age. So the brain, too, is able to heal itself. And we want to do everything in our power to be sure that it's doing so at the very best possible rate. So there's a brain chemical that I think of as Miracle-Gro for your brain. It's called BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor. But just think of it like Miracle-Gro. It promotes the growth of new cells. It makes them grow their roots out further and faster and connect more effectively with other cells. This process is made better by all of these factors. Exercise shows up again, an enriched environment. And let me just say that a lot of this research was done on lab animals. That basically means lab rats. But this first one you see, the exercise, it does not need to be strenuous. But there's one very big difference between human beings and lab rats, and that is if you put a treadmill device in a rat's cage, they will actually use it. They love it. They just run for hours a day. They're not like trying to break up a sweat or anything. They're just loving movement. And that's very much how we have also evolved. An enriched environment simply means having some toys to play with, having some challenges that make your brain think about something in a new or different way, having others to stimulate you or to play with as well. Diet, again, you see some of the same things, not eating too much, bright colors, and omega-3 fats, and also serotonin, the brain chemical serotonin, which is so adversely affected by trauma. If we can find ways to naturally restore serotonin levels, it makes your brain much more capable of healing itself. And then finally, social connection. There's another big factor here, which is age. As we age, we don't create new brain cells quite as fast as we did when we were young, but we still do it throughout our lifetimes. So let me ask you, which do you think, which of these 6 factors, if you count age, which of them is the most powerful at helping your brain grow new brain cells? It's social connection. It is even more potent than age. So they had, in this study, they literally had a group of old rats that got to hang out with other old rats and play and do these various things. They did better than the young rats who were isolated but did everything else right. All the good exercise, the good diet. Social connection is the most potent of all. But exercise is helpful. Movement is really helpful. So the second root of resilience is to manage our energy through keeping ourselves moving. The Center for Disease Control recommends this much exercise or movement per week. 2.5 hours, moderate intensity, 75 minutes if it's more intense. What do you think our ancestors did? How much did they move their bodies in a week? Just think about that for a second. 100 years ago, almost everyone in this country made their living through some sort of physical activity. They did not sit all of the time. They didn't go to the gym either, but they were up doing things, usually outdoors, connected to the seasons, most of the day, almost every day of the week. It's a very, very different way of thinking about movement, and it's something we need to really take more seriously. I include this because I want to illustrate how effective exercise is as a treatment for these conditions. It is not just something we all know that we need to do. There's so much evidence that it is more effective than medications in the treatment. In this study, they were even looking at really quite severe depression, people who had treatment-resistant problems that didn't respond to 2 or 3 or more different medications. At the end of this study, the people who walked, who simply walked most days of the week, a good number of them recovered. I think it's 26% of them received full remission. In the group that did not add walking, 0. Absolutely nobody recovered from the depression. I include this just to illustrate that we don't have to do exercise the way we think of it. This is a treadmill, but this is a Mayo Clinic doctor who used to weigh about over 300 pounds, and he's not very tall. He's an endocrinologist, so it's not like he didn't know how to lose weight. He just couldn't do it like so many of us. And so what he did, he didn't like exercise. He started studying and designing this process he calls non-exercise activated thermogenesis. N-E-A-T, NEAT. Essentially, it just means you're moving a little bit, but you do it throughout the day. So he's got this treadmill, which you can buy, by the way, for about $10,000. It's, great way to keep your metabolism going. Or you can use the principles of just standing up every 20 minutes or so throughout the day, moving around a little bit, simply not being sedentary. The third root of resilience is to align with nature, to remember our own nature and how we need to live in accordance with that. I want to kind of illustrate that in nature, animals like zebras do not develop the stress-related illnesses that are so prevalent for us. And this author, Robert Sapolsky, says that's because they don't suffer from chronic stress like we do. People do. By the way, this photo was photoshopped. It didn't happen quite this way. But Sapolsky says we human beings, we have evolved to be smart enough to make ourselves sick. In other words, it is through our thinking, it is through our minds that so many of these illnesses arise, especially in relationship to stress. So let me just share very briefly a description of how stress occurs in nature. And this is very pertinent to our discussion today about healing from trauma, because this is trauma in real life, real time. So imagine a scene kind of like this, minus a motorcycle, on a African savanna, and you have a herd of gazelles peacefully grazing on the savanna. And then you're watching this. By the way, this is a film done by Peter Levine, who has done a lot of work in bringing the body back into our treatment of trauma. So you're watching this video, and you see the herd of gazelles, and then to the left of your screen, you see a cheetah start racing toward them. And the herd, they look like one organism. They all crouch down, and then they leap, and they just all start running and then kind of spreading out. And you see the cheetah lock in on one poor gazelle. And then he, soon enough catches it, jumps on its back, brings it down, and then you see the gazelle just go stiff. So what has just happened? Looks like it's dead, but in fact, it has just frozen. So there is fight or flight, and when that's ineffective, the body automatically freezes. And this happens to many people when they experience a severe trauma. They freeze. It's a protective mechanism, automatic. It's not something we're trying. But then you keep watching this, and the goal of freezing, if you will, is hoping that the predator will leave you alone because you're dead. It doesn't have an interest in you then. So sure enough, you're watching this, and the cheetah gets up and leaves, and you don't see it again. Gazelle is still laying there looking like it's dead, but in a few moments, maybe a couple minutes, it starts to move a little bit. And then it gets up, and it's really wobbly, just about topples over. And then something very strange happens. It starts to shake its body, almost violently, vigorously. Its entire body is shaking and shaking, and it goes on for minutes, a few minutes. And then it stops, and something even stranger happens. That gazelle walks back to its herd and starts grazing again like none of this had ever happened. It has completely released the stress that it just had carried in a huge, huge amount. That is something that if we could do it in real time, if we could do something like that so it doesn't get locked into our bodies, we could do a lot more towards preventing the kind of post-traumatic stress symptoms that so many of us experience or witness in our clients. Now, that's pretty hard for most of us to do. And so it can still be done after the fact. We can help people get connected back with their bodies, relive some of the memories in a safe setting, a really safe setting, that's crucial. And then do something like that. Do something that relieves that stress, that gets you back in your body and helps you to actually release the memory and the physical memory from your body. And then rest, sleep and rest. This is the most fundamental way we can align with nature, is to keep our daily rhythm as consistent as possible and give ourselves enough rest. And I'm not going to say more about sleep right now, but let me just say this. I have come to the conclusion, after practicing psychiatry for 25 years or so, that sleep is the missing link. It is the linchpin for healing from almost every mental illness. If we can help people get that really, really healthy and normalized, it gives them a much, much better chance of recovering from any of these conditions. And deep rest. A Sabbath is something that's kind of tragic that we have allowed it to go out of our daily lives and the way that we live, because does so much more than just not work. There's so much more to it if we give our attention to the things that are really deeply nourishing, much like we have done today. And then the third thing I'll talk about is neuroplasticity. And simply put, this means the brain is capable of changing and creating new and healthier pathways throughout our lifetimes. It never stops. This was first studied and really discovered with people at the end stage of terminal illness, because they could do this study and look at their brains after they died and find out that they were creating all kinds of new cells and all kinds of new connections or pathways between the cells, even at this terminal stage of their lives. One study I'll just mention really quickly, because it has a lot to do with how we think about working with the mind, and that is this looking at a part of the brain that deals with movement of the hand. So they're just looking at physical movement, and they had these research subjects practice a keyboard technique for 2 weeks, about 2 hours a day. And they found that by doing that, just with one hand, they could look at the opposite side of the brain and find that it had grown about 25% bigger. It's like what happens when you use a dumbbell or something. You are growing muscles, so to speak, within your brain. But then they did something really interesting. They had another group do the same thing, but they did not move their hands. They instructed them, just imagine yourself playing this with your fingers, but don't move your hands. Well, they had the very same growth, 25%, in the part of their brain that deals with movement. And they did not move. They just did it with their imagination, their intention, if you will. Some of you are thinking right now, I know this. You're thinking, this means I don't actually have to exercise. I can just imagine it. So the fourth root of resilience is to calm our minds. These are the first lines of the Dhammapada, one of the most ancient spiritual texts we have access to. And here's what it says: we are what we think. All that we are arises with our thoughts. With our thoughts, we make the world. And the very close corollary to what we're doing with our thoughts is what is happening with our emotions. Rilke says it so beautifully. He says, let everything happen to you, beauty and terror. Just keep going. No feeling is final. So there's this concept in Buddhist psychology. It's called adventitious suffering. This is so pertinent to trauma. So pertinent. So what this says basically is talking about the first and second arrows. The first arrow is the wound that we receive through no fault of our own. Just by living life, every one of us is subject to these wounds, these arrows. That's something we cannot help. Some people have a much, much bigger arrow than others, but we all receive them. But the second arrow is the thing where we have a little bit to say about this. What that means in this way of thinking is that we've been wounded by the first arrow, but then we take another one out of our own quiver and we hurt ourselves with it. That's what happens when we have these very strong emotional reactions to something bad that has happened to us. It might be something really big, but it also might be something really small. And if we have emotional overreactivity with these harmful thoughts and harmful feelings, then we are hurting ourselves. And that's where we need to assert our leverage. And this comes through repeated practice. This is a reminder that our brains are designed to see what is wrong. It's designed that way because it's protective. It helps us stay out of trouble, stay out of danger. So we're constantly looking for what's wrong. If we want to counter that, we have to do it purposely. We've got to have practices that help develop a sense of joy or compassion or openness. The sixth root of resilience is to cultivate a good heart. This is learning to love well, which we heard about so beautifully this morning. And we can do this through practicing skills like compassion, like loving kindness, like gratitude. They are simply skills that every one of us has access to, and we can practice intentionally over and over and over. So we're creating the kind of pathways we want in our brains and our minds. And then finally, the seventh root of resilience is creating deep connections, which we've also been hearing about throughout the day. The Dalai Lama said, we can live without religion. He's head of a religion. He says, we can live without religion and meditation, but we cannot survive without human affection. So I promised you I would tell you the one thing that we can do. There is one thing we can do, and the happiest people are those who can do it to the limit of their ability. We can be completely present. We can be all here. We can give all our attention to the opportunity before us. So I thank you very much for being here throughout this day, and I thank all of you for hosting and creating such a wonderful spirit throughout the day.
Thank you, Dr. Emmons. We have some time for Q&A if anybody is interested.
So how can we make sure that
Okay.
how can we make sure that there are a whole lot more mental health professionals who are working like you are?
So the question, I'm not sure if everybody heard that, how can we make sure there are a lot more health professionals, mental health professionals, doing this type of work? I mean, the fact that so many of you are here today and that so many people are coming to conferences like this makes it very clear there is a hunger for doing things differently. There is a great desire to shift the way that we're thinking about and treating these things. And I think that the answer to your question is that we've got to have opportunities to convene, to come together, to receive training, to receive the kind of supervision that people need to really bring these practices to life in their own work. I really think that we as a country are poised to do this. One, there's such a deep need, which we all know. But I think, I mean, I have witnessed in the last, I would say 5 years, there has been a real shift. I think a real opening to this kind of thing. And I just think that there's the energy and the intention there just waiting to be cultivated.
In your opinion, is resilience a process or a destination?
Wow, great question. Is resilience a process or a destination? I would say it is more the process, because I think resilience is our natural inborn gift. It is one of our natural gifts that I think absolutely everybody has. It's just that many of us have lost it to some degree or another. And so I think the process, which is really never ending, is for us to reclaim it, to restore it, to keep building it bigger. You know, I didn't really say this, but the metaphor, you know, of the filling up the water cooler, there's a much bigger metaphor than that, which is that we can create a greater container. We are not limited by our genetics, by our childhood experiences, by our life experiences. We can create such a bigger container that we can withstand so much more stress and pressure and loss than we ever thought possible. But that's a constant process. That's a lifetime process.
Thank you. I'm Elaine Winham. I was founder of Veteran Resilience Project, and Paul Riedner, our veteran executive director, got one of the Catalyst initiatives. And one of the things that we've been looking at is not only, we use EMDR in 12 sessions, but one of the things we've been growing in with other people is what's called soldier's heart, or moral injury, some would call it. And one of the things that Paul said one day, there was a group of us, you know, just kind of thinking of, you know, how could we do more with this? And he said, well, I think we're the first in this, we're the first in that in Minnesota, but the truth is that everyone is morally injured by the things that veterans have also been injured in. And that if we can't make those shifts, what is there to come back to? And to me, it was like I felt like about 3 things just plunked through my being, and so we look at this a lot more. There have been these community-based presentations today. I didn't get to those, but there's got to be this environment that continues to grow in order for people, you know, I'm sorry I'm getting long here, but I'm thinking of this borderline craze, bipolar craze that's in operation right now. And if you don't call it bipolar and you don't treat it like bipolar, you're in trouble. So can you say something about that?
Yes, and thank you, Elaine. I'm familiar with your work, and I think it's really important work. And I think what you're referring to, you know, there is a huge change in how we diagnose bipolar illness. It is such a dramatic change that within I think it was a 5-year period, the rate of diagnosis increased 20-fold. Not 20%, 20 times more bipolar illness diagnosed than just 5 years earlier. So, there's no way that bipolar illness has increased that much. I think it is maybe a cultural manifestation of all of the things that are creating agitation and rage and imbalance in our society right now. And I also think that for some people, medications play a role in that, and other substances. But I do believe that people are manifesting something that has come in a much bigger way, a different kind of energy into our culture. And I think, I'm really going out on a limb right now, but I think that at this moment in history, there is a real opportunity for us to address these kinds of things. I think it's come to that point that we're having conversations and we're looking at taking on some of these things that we have frankly been kind of just putting under the rug. We've been in denial, and people are now telling the truth. And I think it is forcing us to have some of these really important conversations.
I know nutrition is more complicated than this, but can you speak to some specific foods that help increase serotonin levels?
Yes, I will. So I will give you a very, very brief description of how to eat for healthy serotonin. Serotonin is made from an amino acid called tryptophan. A lot of you have heard of tryptophan because it's in dairy and is found in high amounts in turkey. And so, a lot of people know that after Thanksgiving dinner, you want to go take a nap. And they think it's the turkey, but it's really because you've eaten about 2,000 calories in one setting. But to boost serotonin, you need to allow tryptophan to hang around in the bloodstream long enough that it can make its way into the brain. And that requires a couple of different things. You need to get a little bit of protein every time that you eat. Not a lot, because that's more helpful for dopamine and those more stimulating brain chemicals. But just a little bit of protein with every meal and every snack. And then you need to keep your blood sugar really stable, which means having some healthy fats and having some really good complex carbs every time you eat. Not simple carbs, because they shoot your blood sugar up and then down. And that's not good for serotonin. So keeping blood sugar stable, eating some good healthy carbs, root vegetables, and a little bit of protein every time that you eat.
So is it a policy change or a training change or both to address the fact that so many people can go in and have maybe a 5-minute visit and get a medication for depression or anxiety without being asked about nutrition, sleep, exercise, screen time, or any of these things?
So you're asking, is a policy change needed? Or?
Yeah, what is it going to take? Because that's a standard of practice.
Right, so I think that, I don't think it's a lack of information. I think people know that eating healthier, moving their bodies would serve them well. What I think is missing, and this requires us to think about delivering health care differently, because what we see in our groups is that people make these changes at a much higher rate than they do even if their prescriber recommended exercise or specific diet changes. They make the changes, I think, because they're doing it in community, because they're doing this with others that are dealing with the same thing. They're not isolated. They don't feel alone. They're also individualized recommendations. You cannot say that everybody needs the same exact diet. We are not built that way. People's bodies are different. They need different kinds of nutrients. They need different forms of exercise. I think they even need different kinds of spiritual practice or meditation. Well, thank you.
I'm serious.
That's very nice.
I'm in for that.
So, we have to individualize it better in a more sophisticated way, and I think we need to do things where people are not just on their own. to do it. And that means delivering care in slightly different ways.
Thank you for this wonderful lecture. I won't call it a lecture, but giving us these insightful ways of looking at resiliency. One of my observations of what I've seen in this country, and I've been here since 1970, so it's been a long time, but don't you think we don't give people enough time to process their emotions? Somebody dies in the family, or they have a breakup, or something traumatic happens in their life. It's natural to grieve, and it's natural to feel sad. And some people take a little longer than others. But it's like, oh, if you're sad or you're grieving, you're undergoing depression. Really? And immediately they're put on medication. And I think if we let people, really, the doctors or anybody who really works with them, give them enough time to process and let them know that this is normal. It's okay to feel sad. It's okay to cry sometimes. Don't you think we'll be solving a lot of these? I mean, there'll be only about, I don't know, in what I have seen with my experiences, only about 10% might need the medication. Very few, because they, the family, we have to explain to the family, hey, this is, this person might take, some people take 5-6 years to process it. Nothing wrong. But we have to help them, support them to get on with their life. And there's nothing wrong. Some people, for me, that's a way of showing a part of your personality that, oh, you are a very committed person. You have this certain character trait in you that makes you very committed. If, in case there's a divorce, you are somebody who is committed to the marriage, to that person. And it might take you, there is nothing wrong to still continue loving that person, even though that person is not there. Nothing is stopping you. So, I don't know, that's the way.
Well, I think those are very insightful comments, and I completely agree with you about the need to give people time to experience their emotions. And I think something else that's necessary for that to happen is that we need the capacity to place our attention on our emotions. It doesn't happen anymore automatically because there's so many things that are creating this kind of disturbed or overly active mind. And so people need first to be able to calm their mind enough that they can then learn how to put their attention where they want it to be. And when it comes to emotion, I really think it is as simple as that. It's allowing yourself the time and attention to experience the emotion fully so that it has a chance to leave. And it's experienced somewhere right between your neck and your groin, in your body. But that does require that we place our attention there and also give it time. And those are just skills that are available to everybody. Now, some people, I think their emotions, especially trauma survivors, their emotions can be so overwhelming that they need more than that. They need something else first before it's really safe to be able to experience those feelings in that way. But there's a lot of things that lead up to those big emotional storms that we could perhaps avoid if we were teaching the skills of really good emotional experience. Thank you.
We have one more question, and then.
Thank you, Doctor, for speaking about this. So my question is, as someone who's jumped through many of the mental health loops, going through psychiatrists and different psychotherapists, and I'm wondering, in your professional opinion, since we have this influx of, in the population of people needing mental health services, is the fact that there isn't enough professional support out there for the patients, the lack of trained professionals, the lack of psychotherapists and psychiatrists are out there that particularly are trained along your vein of work, understanding that the soul and the mind and spirit plays a role in their treatment. Is the lack of that and the lack of professionals trained in that, or just the lack of professionals in general, part of the issue to address here? And how can we get more young people interested in this profession to address that problem of serving the population based on how many people are actually out there that are trained to do that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I do think that without question there is a lack of psychiatrists. You know, there's simply not enough access. There are a lot more therapists, but many people don't have access to them, either because of cost barriers or physical, you don't have close physical access. But I do think that there's a need for having more healers, if you will, of all kinds of different trainings and credentials who have the ability to really help people heal from mental and emotional challenges. And again, I think we have to really reconsider the way that we're delivering these things, because I don't know that it makes sense to always try and do it one-on-one. You know, I think there's clearly a role for that. But I really do believe that people can get a lot of skills and a lot of healing in this more cost-effective way of these skills-based groups. So thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Henry Emmons.
Thank you so much.
And